The sound of glass shattering still echoes in my mind. 1 second, my father was laughing, bragging about his real work. The next, the champagne glass slipped from his hand and exploded against the airport floor. Everyone froze. Even the general stopped mid-sentence. That was the moment my father truly saw me, not the daughter he imagined, but the woman I had become. But stories like this don't begin in airports. They start at kitchen tables, where pride sits heavier than truth. A week before that day, I came home to our old house in Springfield, Ohio. The air smelled like motor oil and fried onions. Dad sat at the table, cleaning his worn VFW cap as if it were a crown. Behind him hung a faded photograph, proud men from the factory where he once built America's machines before the jobs disappeared overseas. Back already? He asked without looking up. Just for the weekend, I replied. Got a flight Monday. Commercial, or that hobby thing you do? That hobby was my company, Morgan Aerologistics. Not big, but steady. 2 light jets, 1 turboprop, handling medevac and defense contracts up and down the East Coast. I'd built it from scratch after leaving the Navy. But to him, if I wasn't covered in grease, it didn't count as real work. He sighed, polishing the cap brim. You could have stayed home, learned real work. Tool and die never lies. Neither do flight instruments, I said. He chuckled. Those lie all the time. Pilots just don't notice till it's too late. Mom placed cornbread between us, her quiet peace offering. Dad only looked up when I mentioned my next passenger, a 4-star general. He blinked, then smirked. Guess they'll let anyone fly military brass these days. And just like that, the familiar ache settled in, the kind of hurt only silence can sharpen. The next morning smelled of rain and burnt toast. I found Dad outside, sitting on the back porch, coffee steaming in his hand. He didn't say good morning, just nodded, the way men of his generation do when words feel like weakness. I sat beside him. You know, I said quietly, it's not just cargo I fly. Sometimes it's people, doctors, soldiers, supplies. Real lives. He took a sip, staring straight ahead. Yeah? Well, I hauled steel for 30 years. Built half the bridges in this state. That's real lives too. There it was again, that wall between us. The invisible one made of pride and decades of hard work. I wanted to tell him that what I did wasn't about pride. It was about purpose. But I knew he wouldn't hear it. Not yet. Inside, Mom hummed softly, packing leftovers into plastic tubs for me to take. She always did that, filled the silence with small acts of love. Before I left, she pressed my hand and whispered, "He's proud of you. He just doesn't know how to say it." I smiled, pretending to believe it. That evening, I drove back to the airfield. The runway lights blinked like sleepy eyes under the fog. My aircraft, a Beechcraft King Air, sat waiting, silver and silent. As I ran my pre-flight checks, my phone buzzed. A message from Dad, "Fly safe." I was wrong. Maybe the sky is real work. It wasn't much. But to me, it was everything. For the first time in years, I felt lighter. When I lifted off that night, the world below glowed like scattered embers. I looked down, imagining Dad still on that porch, coffee in hand, watching the same sky I was flying through. Neither of us said goodbye. You never needed to. Sometimes love isn't in the words, it's in the silence that follows them. It was 2 days later when the call came. I was refueling in Richmond, halfway through a medical transport run, when my phone buzzed again, the same local number from home. At first, I ignored it. I was busy, focused, checklist in hand. Then it rang again. And again, by the 4th time, something in my chest went cold. Mom's voice was trembling on the other end. "It's your father, there's been an accident." The words hit harder than turbulence ever could. Remember dropping the headset, the fuel hose still hissing beside the plane. My knees went weak. I drove 3 hours straight through the rain, the kind that blurs the world into gray. The hospital lights were too bright, the air too clean, too sterile for someone who spent his life covered in dust and engine oil. was already gone when I arrived. Heart failure, they said. Quick. No pain, but that didn't make it easier. I sat beside his bed, staring at his hands, rough, cracked, stained with decades of honest work. Hands that built bridges and fixed things I never understood. Hands that never stopped working, even when everything else did. On the table beside him lay that old VFW cap. The same one he'd polished 1,000 times. Inside it, folded carefully, was a piece of paper. Just 2 words written in his crooked handwriting: "You fly higher." That was it. No apology. No goodbye. Just those words, simple, stubborn, exactly like him. When we buried him, the sky was clear. Not a cloud in sight. The pastor spoke of strength and legacy. Mom cried softly, holding the folded flag like it was his last heartbeat. I didn't cry, not then. I just kept looking at the horizon, at that endless stretch of blue where I knew he'd finally learned to look up, because sometimes, the people who never believed in your wings become the wind that keeps you flying. After the funeral, the house felt different. The hum of the old fridge, the creak of the back door, everything carried his echo. Mom kept busy, the way women of her generation do when grief feels too heavy to touch. She'd clean things that were already spotless, cook meals no one ate, hum tunes with no words, stayed in my old room, surrounded by flight posters and childhood dust. That's where I found it, the old shoebox under my bed. Inside were Dad's letters from years ago. Not to me, but to himself. Notes he'd written during layoffs, deployments, birthdays he missed, each one began the same way: "Dear kid, someday you'll understand." I read every one. Some were angry, some tired, but all of them were honest. He'd been proud of me, even when he couldn't say it. He just didn't know how to bridge the space between us. That night, I went back to the airfield. The hangar was dark except for the amber glow of the emergency lights. I sat in the cockpit of my plane and placed his old cap on the dashboard. For a long time, I just sat there, listening to the rain on the metal roof, and in that moment, I realized, pride and love aren't opposites. They're just 2 sides of silence. He wasn't ashamed of me. He was afraid I'd outgrow him. When I started the engine, the propellers hummed like a heartbeat. I looked up, whispering to the empty sky, "You were wrong, Dad. The sky is real work, and I'm still flying." A year has passed since the day we buried him. The world kept spinning, flights kept flying, and yet every takeoff still feels like a conversation with him. I've stopped trying to fill the silence he left. Now, I just listened to it. Last week, I was invited to speak at the local aviation school, the same one where I'd earned my first license. Rows of young cadets sat in crisp uniforms, faces bright with the kind of hope only the sky can give. When they asked how I started flying, I didn't talk about training hours or engines. I told them about a man who built bridges but never crossed one until it was too late. I told them about pride, how it can sound like protection when really it's just fear wearing armor, and how love doesn't always come wrapped in praise or applause. Sometimes, it comes in the form of a man sitting on a porch, coffee in hand, watching a sky he never dared to touch. Afterward, one of the cadets asked, "Do you ever wish you'd said more to him?" I smiled. "No," I said softly. "Because I'm still talking. Every time the wheels leave the ground." That night, I flew home beneath a sky so clear it looked painted. I swear I could almost see him there, sitting somewhere between the clouds, cap tilted, that same quiet pride in his eyes. The runway lights blinked below me, and for a moment everything was still. I reached over and touched the old cap on my dashboard, the one I always bring along now. "You fly higher," he wrote, and I do. Every single time, because some goodbyes aren't endings, they're invitations to keep going. To rise, to remember, and to love louder than silence ever could.